Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler. I'm a guy trying to convey a better human story, which I claim could actually have a beneficial impact on the human future. Uh, Let me say a little bit about what's important that I've seen about the evolutionary perspective. First of all, the evolutionary perspective shows that there was a point in the story of our species which marked an unprecedented step in the whole story of how life has evolved, a point of discontinuity of a significant kind. And that's the point at which a creature steps onto the path of civilization. That there's an unprecedented thing about that, that it creates a life form that wasn't shaped by over huge stretches of time by a process of natural selection, but was invented by a creature that's able to invent its own way of life. What I say, and I think I don't see how you can disagree with it, is that step creates a kind of disorder, inevitably, and that disorder generates a force that drives things to develop in certain directions. I think I show those things. So following the implications of the unprecedented thing that happened when a creature steps out of a niche in which it evolved biologically, it shows that there's a new dynamic that would emerge in the world, because the dynamic selected by natural selection is one in which the interactions of the various actors in the system have been molded by a selective process, so that they create a perpetual motion machine. The lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. In other words, the evolutionary perspective shows us that there's a vital characteristic in the natural order that evolves biologically, and that if a creature has the creative intelligence that enables it to invent its own way of life and pull itself out of that natural order, they're going to be in a new kind of situation, which is not the way life has previously worked. They're going to be in a situation where there isn't any order regulating things. Not the kind of ecological order, not any kind of collective, this is how it's going to be. It's basically going to be a war, an anarchy, which is a war of all against all, which leads to a selective process. And then the evolutionary perspective that we've followed to this point. And go to betterhumanstory.org to see that we do actually get to this point. We can see that there are ramifications that are inevitable to the war of all against all that's inevitably going to emerge when you enter into this kind of disorder. There's the way that brokenness is going to ramify itself, where the war of all against all leads to trauma, which leads to people behaving in broken ways, which leads to more trauma, and everything connects, where one form of brokenness transmits itself into another form of brokenness. Anyway, go to A Better Human Story and take a look at A Fateful Step, and you'll see I try to show in a very social scientific way that there is such a thing as a coherent force that we can see moving through the human world, that consistently works to make the human world more broken, or make the human civilization worse. And I say that Gee, that's a lot how evil has been understood in certain dimensions of Western civilization. They've thought about what a force of evil might be. So I think it's legitimate to call it that, but I know that liberals have trouble with it. There are other names you can give it. But I think that what I'm saying is that the evolutionary perspective, by focusing on the transition from order to disorder, is able to show how a coherent force that you might call evil, reasonably, will be a natural major component of what's driving the world of any creature that steps onto the path of civilization. So looking at that evolutionary perspective that you've moved from into a whole new kind of life form that's the fruit of the imagination of a creature. That one of the ramifications of that is you're dealing with disorder between entities that can take a whole lot of different forms and can choose a whole lot of different ways of acting, which means there's going to be a selective process of which ones prevail in a war of all against all, but against a vast number of human potentialities. And only certain non-random ones are going to occur. And you could call it an evil force. You could say something like the spirit of the gangster exerts a disproportionate say in how civilization is going to survive, to evolve, I mean. Civilization is bound to evolve in rather broken ways because of the disorder in the system, not the nature of the creature. That's an important distinction to make, and we are better creatures than we have imagined ourselves to be when we look at a human history or how much ugliness there is in the world around us. We're looking at a world as the human world is full of brokenness that was inevitable once our species took that unprecedented step into extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. In other words, we unleashed something because we were the most creative, intellectually capable creatures that life on Earth had produced yet. If it hadn't been us, I don't know, would it have been somebody tracing their ancestries back to bonobos some millions of years from now? Would it be some descendant of an elephant? I don't know. But eventually, I expect there would be some creature that developed the brain power to change the rules and create a new kind of life form. Who knew that there would be an inevitable struggle for power, a war of all against all, a selection for the ways of power, and all the trauma that would ensue from that as brokenness got transmitted from generation to generation because of the inescapable war of all against all, which events in Ukraine in the last couple of years show. We still haven't solved that problem. It's in the system. And the evolutionary perspective shows that you got to perceive these things in systemic ways. When I grew up and people looked at human civilization, they did not look at it as being the outgrowth of a whole evolutionary process that had gone before. They only looked back to the monuments of the ancient world. I mean, there was a little bit that was evolutionary, but very, very little. The beginnings really are empires in the Middle East and such, then Athens and Jerusalem. Taking for granted that, of course, we're going to create civilization. So maybe that's what's gotten in the way of people looking at the really essential turning point that is necessarily involved when a creature does something that had never been done before, inventing its way of life, and putting itself in a position that was disordered in a way that life had never been disordered before. Meaning, disordered meaning there wasn't any order that controlled how things interacted. We could see in Somalia in the 90s and back before that, in Lebanon in the late 70s and early 80s, that when you've got a diversity of forces contending in a situation where there is no power to hold them in check, no order to govern how they interact, we saw that what rises to dominate is our warlords, the spirit of the gangster. And that's what the rise of civilization looks like in all the half dozen places around the world that it arose in an independent form. I've been wondering lately, because I've been saying that more and more often. I do believe that that's true, but I think I'm not sure how much I'm oversimplifying it. I do think that you find tyranny, slavery, exploitation, the many being sacrificed for the good of the few. I think that is sort of general in civilization. American democracy is one of the giant steps that ever got taken to reverse that. A line that I use all the time is a quotation from Thucydides, who puts it in the mouth of the Athenians who are about to exterminate the people on this island. You know as well as we do that among us humans, the way the world is, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And, that's the battle that human beings have been fighting ever since civilization emerged. And now we're having an election to try to prevent the dark side of that dichotomy from prevailing in the world after we Americans have been so blessed to have a constitutional system that made a really pretty damn good effort to control how power operated so that the will of the people would express itself. And they had their aristocratic distrust of the mob, and they did what they did. But it was a whole lot better than the divine right of kings. So the evolutionary perspective helps to put all that in perspective. But there's another part of the evolutionary perspective that's also more recently. There is a direction in which civilization is going to evolve that becomes clearer if you look at an evolutionary perspective. There's also the rise of evil as an as a dynamic. The rise of a coherent force of brokenness as an inescapable dynamic that would beset any creature that stepped across that threshold, extricating itself, etc. But there's also looking how the evolutionary perspective, not only about the brokenness, but about the sources of wholeness. The sources of wholeness, have to do with how inspired are we to defend the good, and how inspired are we to defend the sacred. One's got to do with a moral dimension, a better and a worse. And the other has got to do with a spiritual dimension, which has got to do with a certain quality or depth or something of experience. And both of them are built into what we evolved to be. we have experiential tendencies. That's the expression I like to use. And I'm really quite fascinated to ask the question about each one of these experiential tendencies. How did this get here? Meaning, and I think in a case like this, we can probably assume that the ancestors of ours who had these experiential tendencies were more likely to get their DNA into the future than the ones that lacked it. In other words, the impact of having these experiential tendencies, what people felt motivated to do, was more led better to a path, at least enough. That's what evolution basically is about. It says of the various options, the ones that are best constructed to get their DNA into the future will get their DNA into the future. I mean, natural selection is just sort of naturally happens. Once you've got self-replicating things, how can it not happen? So it's kind of a wonderful form of automicity that once you got self-replicating whatevers, some of them are going to be perpetuated, their blueprint, and others will not. And it's not going to be random which ones they are. So one of the among the questions I ask is, why do we laugh? Why do we have a inborn capacity to find things funny? Well, that's not to be taken for granted. I don't know how many species have got a sense of humor. And I've also wondered about, why did we evolve for music to be important to us? That seems to be true across cultures and around the world. So I'm interested in those. But in terms of the battle that human civilization survive, the two dimensions that seem to me the most important about our experiential tendencies is the moral dimension, which is to say we experience things in a way which differentiates between the better and the worse, and which feel better and feel worse. And it really, the evolutionary perspective, I think, calls for us to recognize that the whole issue of value is inherently has to be anchored in the experiential realm. The secular worldview that regards what's experiential as merely subjective misses the whole thing. Not only do we have inborn tendencies which apparently were life-serving for our ancestors because they've been selected for, but we've got ways of experiencing things that have an impact on us that apparently is built into our genome. I mean, you look around the world, and there are a lot of people who've had spiritually transformative experiences. There are some kinds of polls where I think like 1/3 of people are able to go to some kind of experience that we could describe as being more real, and and showing something which is seared in as being especially important, and coming back with truths that one lives by, and having one's life maybe impacted and taking a different direction. That seems to be, if not an experiential tendency, it's an experiential capacity. So apparently, we have value coming into the world when we have creatures that are able to have experience that's experienced positively, connected with the better experience versus the worse. It really does matter about whether the kitten is being stroked and fondled or being tortured. If that doesn't matter, how could anything matter? The experience of creatures for whom things matter is an emergent reality that you can see in the evolutionary perspective. What it gets selected for is those creatures who are motivated to do what will help them get their DNA into the future. And that means that there will be a real correlation between what feels good, and therefore a creature seeks out that good experience, and what feels terrible, and therefore the creature is motivated to avoid that kind of experience. So the value emerges in the experiential realm of individual creatures, and then there is a sort of a complex kind of summation that takes place in the realm of life, where the good gets to sort of have two components that are kind of hard to know exactly how you would add them all up. But the positive is life surviving, and the positive is also life thriving and feeling good about the experience of being alive. And how much weight we give to human beings, and how much weight to dolphins, and how much weight we give to the mice in the field. Who knows? But that's where basically goodness must lie, is in creatures having experience which is positive. And it's not just for any given moment. Goodness has also got to do with an order that enables life to continue. If you believe in the value of life, and I'm not sure I could prove that life is a plus, but I always seem to assume it. Is that for a good reason? Or maybe we could say that evolution is selected for people who will regard life as a positive. If we are submerged in water and we're not able to breathe, I mean, the energy that we get to bring ourselves to the surface and breathe air again, it's really been selected for. It's kind of interesting, all the things that are selected for. But they are not merely subjective. If what's selected for is certain tendencies of human experience, such as I think that our basic nature is really pretty much geared to wanting the world to be more peaceful, less at war, more just, not as unjust, more filled with love, not with hate. I think we could. This is what we want, and we have the values in the right place, I think, and we need to take them seriously. Liberal America has manifestly given the realm of value second-rate status. It's merely subjective, a matter of opinion. I've heard it so many times. But there's room for the subjective dimension, and there's room for various opinions. But underlying it, there's something that's built into us, and it got built into us because it was conducive both to the survival of our ancestors and to the sense of fulfillment for the people who produced us. We are motivated to seek out the things that drive life forward. When we're hungry, we get pleasure in a good meal. When I was a football player practicing in Minnesota before high school began, on hot, humid August days, and our coaches wouldn't let us drink water, I felt such an intense craving that it was perhaps the most excruciating experience of the instinctual desire to get what one needs to survive. And I remember drinking after practice. I mean, it was foolish for them not to let us drink, but that was the conventional wisdom of the time. But it got increasingly like being submerged in the water and unable to breathe. So we have it built into us to want to live, and I think that is a positive thing. Uh, there is a tension. Um, I don't know exactly how it's to be balanced. Is evolution our friend? Well, it does is in a really important way, which I'll get to in a second. But also, it's a place in which it's completely opportunistic, and there are all kinds of parasites and hosts and predators and prey and conflicting interests. And life unfolding in a completely unplanned way that just it goes the way it goes, just the way that water would go down a hill, um, just finding its way the whatever way it finds its way. That's the way evolution works, but it creates certain kinds of order as it goes along. And one of the things it creates a set of values that we can tune into. Even though we may differ one from another and one culture from another in important ways, the amount that we actually do have in common as human beings is a meaningful sense of what the good is for us human beings. Value is real, just as the distinction between better and worse dimensions of experience is necessarily and by definition real. So the secular worldview needs to stop denigrating the moral dimension. It's not easy to judge exactly, what is the wisest path toward goodness here or wherever, but there is such a thing, or there are different alternatives. The nature of the challenge is at that level. Uh, we are challenged to find our way into a better human story, um, where the destructive dynamic has been disarmed from its power to shape the human world. We are we should draw inspiration from the knowledge that when you have something like Trump versus Biden in a presidential election, you don't have to look too far to see a genuine core that this is actually between a force of wholeness and a force of brokenness. And you could actually reasonably say this behaves a lot like the battle between good and evil used to be understood. You can really see it. And liberal America would have been a whole lot more powerful in protecting American democracy if it had seen deeper into that reality earlier. But it's clear enough now. So one of these dimensions of the evolutionary perspective is to encourage us to recognize that the best way of talking about this election is to be deeply plugged into the dimension of good and evil, right and wrong, democracy, fascism, and also to not be, since so much of what is at stake is what we might reasonably, and people have experienced as sacred. The things that are at stake in this election, people have experienced as sacred. And that being the case, the fact that we have a capacity for experience at that level, that capacity wouldn't be there if it hadn't been the case that the ancestors who had that capacity did more took a better course through the challenge of survival than did the ancestors that lacked it. I like to call that proof that it was life-serving. If you've got a non-random selection for those peoples who are having these profound experiences, Well, the fact that that it was selected for us, it suggests that that what we can find and experience at that level is likely to be something we should treat as important, as helping us to succeed with where we need to succeed. Because if we take seriously those experiences at the level of that changed the course of my life, we are fortifying the side that might help us survive as human civilization. We are engaged in a battle between two coherent forces that inevitably emerged because we took an unprecedented step out of the natural order. But it naturally gave rise to a force of evil. Reasonable to call that that. But fortunately, the biological evolutionary process also allows us to see that we have in the moral and spiritual dimensions of our experience, between the better and the worse, and between certain levels of spiritual experience, that this is a place to which attention should be paid. We should be inspired by what is inspiring. The fact that it's inspiring tells us historically through our ancestry, it was good to get inspired by this kind of thing. So we have a new human territory is meeting an ancient human capacity when we send astronauts up to see the Earth in a way that humans had never seen it before. And a couple of them have spiritually transformative experiences. A message got delivered that found its way around the world in the form of a famous poster called the Blue Marble, where the sacredness of the earth and the fragility of the earth were somehow conveyed to a large part of our civilization. A spiritually transformative experience that has a constructive, life-serving message. And so I've talked about what the Democrats should be ready to do between now and the election of 2020. A whole campaign of moving people by appealing to them in the most effective available way on the moral dimension and on the spiritual dimension, so that passions get enlisted in defense of American democracy. So there is that level of things that the message to America needs to reach. Liberal America has been very weak in calling attention to a darkness that I first started seeing rising in like 1990. Led to all kinds of adventures having to do with radio and my reaction to Rush Limbaugh. But then I really saw what was rising in 2004. And I've been on that campaign ever since. What do we do with the task now of maximizing how much we show, how impactfully we show what it is that has taken over the right, and why it is that voting for Joe Biden is what every American who believes in democracy and not in fascism must do. Liberal America was weak in responding at those levels for decades. And it was weak in part because it doesn't take seriously those things that get their important reality in the experiential realm. But the experiential realm is significantly shaped by an evolutionary process, which is aligned with life over death, which amounts to also good over evil in a rough sort of a way. Liberal America can see now in the person of Donald Trump a consistency of brokenness that should have alerted liberal America sooner. And I'll make a video sometime about why it didn't. But now I think liberal America is fully awakened to how crazy and how destructive, how dishonest, how utterly lacking in integrity, how just off the wall and ugly the force running the right has become. You know, when somebody like Lynn Cheney, honoring her oath of office, makes her an outcast. When voting to acquit the most impeachable, conceivable president, just bizarre. But anyway, it's visible now. And there remain millions of people who still haven't seen it. It was always the responsibility of the Democrats to make the Republicans pay for what they were becoming, which was indefensible. You know, like their obstructionism, indefensible. They're lying us into a war, indefensible. The torture memo, indefensible. The way they went after Clinton to any way whatsoever of nullifying the person the American people had hired to do an important job, indefensible. The same as their obstructionism of Joe Biden, indefensible. Liberal America never pressed that battle. And now is a time where the battle must be pressed again. People do see what's out there. But I would like to see Democrats organizing messages that appeal to those places in us where we feel somewhat passionately about what's better and what's worse, what's good and what's evil, and and have a passionate commitment to being defenders of what's sacred. The evolutionary perspective shows how those are absolutely reasonable, required aspects of how we think of the moral and spiritual dimensions. They are real, they are important, and they are life-serving.